Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are on our fourth lesson here about the Cold War, the second to last lesson that we'll be looking at, so we're almost there. What we're going to look at now is the impact of the Cold War in Asia and the Middle East. So you should have this worksheet out in front of you. You should have your notes from Nicaragua and Guatemala from the last video all written here, and we're going to look at the rest of this. You should also have this worksheet about the Cold War and Cambodia out in front of you, and we're going to get to that also in this lesson. All right, so let's jump into it. First of all, please add these terms to know on your terms to know chart that are there. There's a box that's shaded in with a bunch of terms to know. There's just a few extra ones. Some of them, like Sandinistas, was from the last video, and some of the other ones also include what is on the second worksheet with Pol Pot and the Cold War in Cambodia. So please make sure you have these terms to know also written down and that you can identify and explain all of these just like all your other terms to know. Okay, so let's start here with a press conference with President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1954. In 1954, there's a press conference, and a reporter asked the president, "Mr. President, would you mind commenting on the strategic importance of Indochina for the free world? I think there has been across the country some lack of understanding on just what it means to us." By the way, when we say Indochina, everybody, this is the area we're talking about, Indochina, the area where Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos are located. So the reporter is asking here, Eisenhower, why should the United States care about what's happening here in Indochina all the way across the world? And what Eisenhower responds here is very important, and it explains a lot of the actions that take place in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s involving the Cold War. So take a second here to read what Eisenhower's response is, especially that bolded part that talks about the falling domino principle. Okay, so this speech here has been shaped to what has been called the domino theory. So can you figure out what the domino theory means? Basically, what it means here is what this picture is showing, is that if one nation falls to communism, just like dominoes will all fall, all the other nations around them will also fall to communism. So the official definition of the domino theory is it's a theory that a political event in one country will cause similar events in neighboring countries, like a falling domino causing an entire row of upended dominoes to fall. Essentially, what's important here is this second bullet. So when you're writing down the definition, write down something that has to do with this second bullet here. That it was used during the Cold War to justify military and political interventions in places around the world, with the idea that if one nation fell to communism, other would fall as well. Now, in the last lesson, there was a little video on Nicaragua where the domino theory was mentioned. So the actions that the United States takes in Nicaragua, helping the Contras rebel against the Sandinistas, that was done with the justification of the domino theory, that if Nicaragua fell to communism, all those other Latin American nations would, and that would be bad for the United States. What we're going to focus on here, though, is how the domino theory is used in Indochina. So it's first used in the Korean War. So make sure you flip to the back of the worksheet here, and let's get into the Korean War. So the Korean War has its background in World War II. Now, first of all, let's go back even further. Korea, for much of its existence, was a tribute state to China. That all changed in the early 20th century when Japan began building its empire. If you recall, after the Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese became the dominant force on the Korean peninsula. So prior to World War II, and now we're going to read along with what's on your worksheet. Prior to World War II, Korea was invaded by Japan and annexed as part of the expanding Japanese Empire. After Japan was defeated in World War II, Korea was supposed to be reestablished as an independent nation. But until stability could be achieved and elections held, it was occupied by the Soviet Union and the United States in two separate pieces. So you can see that here in the map to your right. The Soviet Union occupied north of the 38th parallel and the United States south of it. This was very much like the way that Germany was split up. And just like in Germany, the two superpowers couldn't agree on the terms of a united Korea. So that is your background there. Once World War II is over and the Japanese are no longer occupying Korea, it's supposed to become an independent state. However, it was split between the Soviet Union and the United States. So the North becomes communist, whereas the South becomes more democratic. And just like that, now Korea has been dragged into the tensions of the Cold War. Okay, so here are the important notes that you should have written down. So pause here and make sure you write all of this in your box. In 1948, two separate governments are set up. North of the 38th parallel, that government becomes a communist government. In 1950, the communist government in North Korea felt like the entire peninsula should be under their control. So, supported by the Soviet Union and China, North Korea invaded South Korea. The United States and the UN troops came to the aid of South Korea, and the Korean War is fought. They fight for about 3 years, and the war produces a stalemate. Nobody really gains any territory, nobody loses it. So at the end of 3 years of fighting and thousands of deaths, Korea remains divided at the 38th parallel. Now, the 38th parallel around there was a demilitarized zone where neither nations were allowed to put their military. This is still the situation today in Korea. Korea today is still divided along the 38th parallel. This is still a demilitarized zone, and North Korea is still a communist-style government, although the communism that develops in North Korea is a different type of communism than you saw in China or in the Soviet Union. This picture here is the current leader of North Korea. You guys should be familiar with him, Kim Jong-un. His grandfather, Kim Il-sung, was the leader of the communists in North Korea during the Korean War. And once they get their independent nation, although they did not succeed in conquering South Korea, his communist government that he set up more focused on the hero worship of the leader, more focused on Korean nationalism, a little more extreme. It's kind of like combining some features of fascism with communism with the government that was set up in North Korea. So today that is still the type of government. That's why when you think of North Korea and we think of all the craziness that goes on there, the roots go back to the Cold War and the Korean War. Okay, so hopefully that made some sense to you guys. If you have any questions we went through too fast, just make sure you write stuff down and you come into class with it. Now more, I don't want to say significant, but more impactful for the United States are the events that take place in Vietnam in the same region after World War II. So Vietnam was a French colony. You can fill in French here. I don't have a pen, I'm writing on my mouse, that's why it looks like there's like a 2-year-old writing this. Oops, that says French. It was a French colony before World War II. Here you see on the map, this blue area is the extent of the French Empire from 1919 to 1939. And you can see here, Indochina was called French Indochina before the Second World War. Now, while the French ruled, a group called the Viet Minh, or Vietnamese nationalists, began to grow and rally against French rule. Now put this in context with what is going on across the world after World War II. Remember, after the Second World War, Europe is defeated, or is not defeated, but has weakened in power immensely, and you start to see a trend of decolonization after World War II. The same is true in Vietnam. So Vietnam was a French colony before World War II. During the war, it was part of the Japanese Empire. After the war ended and Japan was defeated, the French then tried to reclaim it. Now, once again, remember, part of this process of decolonization, you have that Viet Minh, the Vietnamese nationalist group, who do not want to go back under French control. So they rally against the French. The nationalists, these Viet Minh, fight for independence under the leadership of a man named Ho Chi Minh, this guy right here. So Ho Chi Minh emerges as the leader of the Viet Minh, and he rallies them to fight against the French for independence. Now, Ho Chi Minh is also a communist. So him and his Viet Minh used guerrilla warfare techniques. And if you know anything about guerrilla warfare, it's very difficult to defeat an enemy that you cannot see. And this has been the case over and over in history. And this guerrilla warfare techniques end up working against the French. In 1954, the French are defeated at Dien Bien Phu, and they realize that trying to hold on to Vietnam is going to be more difficult than they thought. So in 1954, after this defeat, there is a peace conference in Geneva where the French agree to leave Vietnam alone. So let's go to the worksheet here and let's just read the summary about Vietnam. After World War II, the French tried to hold on to their colony of Indochina, but nationalists known as the Viet Minh fought them back. By 1954, the Viet Minh's guerrilla warfare techniques succeeded in frustrating the French, and an accord was signed in Geneva dividing the nation into two pieces. The communists under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh gained control of the land north of the 17th parallel, where Ngo Dinh Diem became the president of the Democratic South. Under its new constitution, North Vietnam supported the reunification of Vietnam as a communist state. Ho Chi Minh supported communist guerrillas in the South, and soon war broke out. So that is your background. Similar to Korea, you have the North that becomes communist, and you have the South that remains democratic, and the nation splits. Similar to Korea, the North felt like the entire country should be unified under a communist state, and they prompt a war. Okay, so here's the important stuff that you should have in your box about the Vietnam War. So pause right here and make sure you write all these down. Now I'm going to also go through and explain some of these notes as well. So just like we said, in 1954, a peace conference divides Vietnam. The North becomes communist, the South becomes democratic. The U.S. supported the French at first, and then after the French leave, they support the South Vietnamese. Now let's stop here. Why do they support the French? Why do they support the South Vietnamese? Again, the answer is the domino theory. The fear is if the North is successful, then communism will be successful, and if Vietnam falls, it's just a matter of time before the rest of them fall. So this support, by 1965, launches into a full-scale war. There's discontent in the South, and there's a lot of people in the South who are not necessarily so pro a democratic government. So you have these guerrilla groups here who are living in the South but feel like the South should be communist as well. So these guys, a group called the Viet Cong, are these secret guerrilla fighters who begin to launch attacks against the South Vietnamese troops as well as the U.S. troops that are in Vietnam. They make it very, very difficult for the United States to win this war. Again, guerrilla warfare and guerrilla enemies are very, very difficult to fight. It is almost impossible to fight an enemy that you can't see. These Viet Minh disguised themselves as South Vietnamese soldiers, as South Vietnamese civilians, and it was hard for the Americans to really know who their true enemy was. In addition, also at home in the United States, this is a very, very unpopular war. If you recall from 8th grade, the 1960s in the United States is a time of lots of social changes going on, lots of protests about all different things, including the Vietnam War. So all these tensions at home were happening as well, and there was not a lot of support for the war at home. So that led to 1973, finally after almost a decade of fighting in Vietnam, the U.S. troops are finally removed and the South falls to the North. So unlike Korea, Vietnam does not remain divided, and the North conquers the South, and Vietnam becomes a communist nation. Now, the United States likes to boast very proudly that we have never lost a war. Now, that is true. In a declared war, we have never lost a war that's been declared. The Vietnam War was never a declared war, and by all intents and purposes here, this really was a defeat for the United States, and it was probably one of the worst defeats in the Cold War, these events that took place in Vietnam. But for our purposes, being a world history course, you guys just need to focus on the larger world impact here of what happens in Vietnam. Okay, so why is the United States getting involved in these wars? Just like there was a lot of discontent, especially in Vietnam, about why the United States over here fighting across the world in a war that really doesn't mean anything to the American people. So go back to what we started the lesson with. The reason is that domino theory. Now, Korea and Vietnam are both what are called proxy wars. So this is a Cold War, meaning the United States and the Soviet Union never actually fight each other. However, there were some so-called hot wars, which were fought between other nations, such as in Korea, such as in Vietnam, such as in Nicaragua. So proxy wars are regional wars in which the superpowers arm, train, finance, and sometimes send troops to help the combatants. So it's like basically instead of the Soviet Union and the United States fighting each other, they got people to do their dirty work for them. They got other people to fight their wars for them. So a lot of the times I like to think about proxy wars like these Rock'em Sock'em robots, if you guys have ever seen these games, where you're pressing the buttons for these robots to fight, but you're not actually fighting yourselves. Now, in the context of the Cold War, it's not these two happy kids that are fighting, it's the United States and the Soviet Union that are using places like Vietnam and Korea and the Sandinistas and the Contras and all of that to do the fighting for them. And that's really what the Cold War is. So when we say a Cold War, it's not that there was no armed conflict ever, because there was a lot of armed conflict, but there was no actual conflict between the two major powers. They got other people to fight for them in these proxy wars. Okay, so let's now shift our attention to the Middle East. The Middle East, in particular, Egypt, also gets embroiled into these Cold War conflicts. So why would Egypt be a significant area of tensions during the Cold War? Think about it. What do you know about Egypt? Why is it a strategic location for Western powers and for the Soviet Union? Yes, hopefully you're thinking about the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal, a hugely important area of strategic importance. So we're going to stop here for a second. We'll get back to Nasser in 1 minute. Oh, where is it? Okay, sorry, here it is. We're going to stop here just to watch this very short little cartoon video which summarizes some of the major things you should know about the Suez Canal. Okay, so we're going to stop it there. Fun little video cartoon and some really cool music. But yeah, I know, not whatever. So let's kind of review what you need to know about the Suez Canal and what happens here with the so-called Suez Crisis. All right, so let's look at your worksheet, the summary where it says Egypt. Egypt had won its independence in early 1922. So remember, Egypt was a British colony during the age of imperialism, largely because of the Suez Canal, because although it was the French guy that began the building of it, it was largely British and French money that paid for it, and then the British outright took control of it and the colony of Egypt by the late 19th century. Now, Egypt wins its independence after the Second World War early in 1922, although it kept extremely close ties to Great Britain. In the 1950s, as the independence movement gathered steam in Africa, Gamal Nasser, a general in the Egyptian army, overthrew the king and established a republic. He nationalized industries, including the Suez Canal, and then became embroiled in Middle Eastern conflicts. Nasser's actions emboldened other Islamic nationalists to seek independence, and soon the African nations along the Mediterranean were free. Okay, so pretty soon after the Egyptians gained independence, they of course kept close ties with Great Britain. Why? The Suez Canal. The British want to maintain control of it, and they actually even kept their armed forces in the Suez Canal zone even after they gave independence to Egypt. Now, by the 1930s, Nasser, and later on to the 1940s, Nasser gains control of Egypt. He overthrows the king. He names himself prime minister. And at that point, he begins to launch some reforms. Now, Nasser saw himself as the leader of this pan-Arab movement, this movement that would unite all Arabs together against Western control and against the influence of the West. So because of that, he jumps into a number of reforms in Egypt. So take a second and write these reforms down the box. Please make sure you're writing small. There are going to be a number of notes about the Suez Crisis you're going to also have to add to this box. So under Nasser, he launches state-controlled reform. He increases militarism, he suppresses opposition, and he's supported by the army. Again, as I mentioned before, he is extremely pro-Arab, and he wants Egypt to be the head of the Arab world. He adopted what's called a non-alignment policy. Non-alignment meant that you don't join the United States, the Democrats, or you don't join the Soviet Union and the communists. So he's kind of trying, what's good about non-alignment is you can play both sides. So Nasser was really smart, and he knew that he didn't want to officially align with one side, but he wants to play both sides. Now, the key thing that happens that launches into this so-called Suez Crisis is when Nasser nationalizes his industries, including the Suez Canal. So he basically says, okay, now the Suez Canal belongs to Egypt, not to the British, not to the French, not to anybody else, but just to the Egyptians. The British obviously are not very happy with this. Now, the reason why Nasser did this is because he wanted to build a dam here, at a place called the Aswan Dam in the Nile River. He needed money and resources to do it. Well, the British and the French withdrew their money and their resources from Nasser, so Nasser got mad and he said, well, if you're not going to give money for the dam, then I'm taking this canal. And the canal now belongs to Egypt, not to you anymore. So the British and the French respond with armed forces. So on the other side of the box, I told you to write small, add these notes here about the Suez Crisis. So the Suez Crisis, the canal, starts when Nasser takes the canal and puts it under Egyptian control. The British and the French want multinational control of the canal, so they launch an attack on Egypt. They combine their forces with the newly created country of Israel. A little bit more on that later on when we talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict of why Israel sides with the British and the French. But the British, the French, and Israel begin an attack on Egypt. Now here, interestingly, the United States condemns this attack, and he basically says, that they're not going to support what the British and the French are doing here. So that's going to make it a little bit hard for the British and the French to actually succeed in what they're doing once the United States withdraws their support. Nasser turns to the USSR for support since the United States was not getting involved. Basically, it's this huge crisis. There's some bombing that goes on for a little while, and then eventually a UN peacekeeping unit is deployed to the region. The British and the French remove their troops, and they are replaced here with a UN peacekeeping troop that allows international control of the Suez Canal. Now, the results of this are important here. The British and the French, this is embarrassing for them that they kind of make a mistake here. They don't actually get full control of their canal, and this crisis really shows in the 1950s that the British and the French are no longer the strong, powerful nations that they used to be. Now, even though Nasser has to allow this UN peacekeeping force in the Suez Canal zone, he does emerge here as a strong leader against imperial powers. He stood up to the old imperial powers of the British and the French. He stands up to Egypt, and he basically calls their bluff there and says, you were going to attack us, and we stood up to you. And the Arab world begins to look at Nasser as this strong leader So that's how the Suez Canal, and the Suez Canal crisis is interesting because it's a number of different conflicts coming together. It's old imperial conflicts coming together with the Cold War conflicts and also with this Arab-Israeli conflict that goes on after World War II as well. Okay, so that's the important stuff there about the Suez crisis and how Egypt gets brought into the Cold War as well. So finally, let's look at Cambodia. Go to the worksheet on the Cold War in Cambodia now. Cambodia is a nation also located in Indochina, right next to Vietnam. So Cambodia gets pulled into the Cold War in 1970 when the U.S. President Richard Nixon expands the war into Cambodia, the Vietnam War, into Cambodia by bombing and invading. So stop here and just read the first document up there to give you a little sense of how Nixon's invasion of Cambodia affected the country. So what you should focus on here is the second paragraph here. From the ashes of rural Cambodia arose Pol Pot's Communist Party. So basically this bombing and this invasion, the devastation, allowed Pol Pot, a man named Pol Pot, and his Communist Party to come to power. And Pol Pot and the Communist Party will be one of the most brutal, oppressive regimes that has ever existed in the 20th century. And that's saying a lot for the 20th century. You know, considering that we've talked about evil men like Hitler and Stalin, Pol Pot is up there right with those guys. So now take a second and read that second document there. Okay, so that document there gives you a sense on what Pol Pot's rule was like. Then you can read the bottom part where it says Pol Pot and his inner circle of revolutionaries adopted a communism based on Maoism and Stalinism. Then they carried it to the extremes. They and their Khmer Rouge movement tore apart Cambodia in an attempt to purify the country's agrarian society and turn people into revolutionary workers, peasants. So Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge regime end up being one of the most brutal, oppressive regimes in the history of the world. Their policies result in something called the killing fields. And yes, those pictures are actual human skulls, even that one on the top, of victims of the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot. So we're going to watch one more video here that gives you a sense of this genocide that took place under Pol Pot's reign in Cambodia.
See that tower? That tower pictured above looks beautiful, doesn't it? Look a little closer. You'll discover, as I later did, that it's filled with human skulls. When visiting Cambodia, it's incredibly important to visit this place. Only then you can begin to understand modern Cambodia. At first, it looked beautiful and peaceful, like a public park. But as time goes on, you grow silent, and each fact you learn will sicken you more than the last. The killing fields are a place where the Khmer Rouge killed and buried thousands of people, led by Pol Pot. The Khmer Rouge killed anyone who stood in their way. Intellectuals and anyone with an education were particular targets of theirs. People would be killed if they spoke another language. People would even be killed for wearing glasses.
Oh, technical difficulties. Whoa. Hold on. Let's see if... Oh, no.
People would be killed if they spoke another language. People...
Whoops. Oh, we'll try again.
Anyone with an education.
Let's try this again. Sorry, guys.
Particular targets of theirs. People would be killed if they spoke another language. People would even be killed for wearing glasses.
Ah. All right. So I guess we're having some difficulties here. I'm going to post the link to this video as well on in the assignment here, so you can just watch the end of it. Basically, it's just going to show you the brutality of the Khmer Rouge, and one of the worst genocides of the 20th century is what happened in Cambodia in the 1970s. Sorry about the video not working. It was actually, it's a pretty good video that gives you a really good sense of the atrocities that happen here. And it's interesting and it's important to note because after the Holocaust, everybody said never again, never again, never again. And what happened in Cambodia was it happening again. And we're going to see that again in the 1990s and again, into the 21st century, that events like this continue to happen. Okay. So the wrap up for this lesson here is to what extent was the Cold War globalized by the 1980s. At this point here we talked about Indochina, we talked about the Middle East a little bit, especially in Egypt, and you should have a sense now about how, between this lesson and the lesson before, about how the Cold War really becomes a global conflict. Okay, so that's the end here for this lesson. Again, guys, make sure that, I think we went through a lot of information in the last two lessons, so make sure that you're writing down any questions that you might have, and don't be afraid to ask them. So that's it for now, and I'll see you guys in the next and last video on the end of the Cold War. Thanks. See you later. Bye.